Commander Kala stood on the bridge of the Starward Dawn and watched her world die on the screens before her. The massive ship shook as another plasma blast struck its shields. Around her, officers from 12 different alien species worked desperately at their stations. Their faces showed the same thing she felt in her heart. They were losing this war. 3 years ago, the Galactic Alliance had been strong. Thousands of ships from dozens of worlds had formed the greatest military force the galaxy had ever seen. Now only 200 vessels remained. The rest had been destroyed or consumed by the enemy that called itself the Void Swarm. The Swarm was unlike anything the galaxy had faced before. They were not just machines or living creatures. They were both. Their ships looked like nightmares made real. Metal twisted with flesh, weapons that grew from living tissue, and worst of all, they learned. Every time the Alliance found a way to hurt them, the Swarm adapted. What worked in one battle failed in the next. Kala watched the tactical display. As red dots swarmed around the few remaining blue ones, each red dot was a swarm ship. Each blue dot was all that stood between the enemy and billions of innocent lives. The math was simple and terrible. They could not win. Commander called out Lieutenant Dex from the communications station. His forearms moved quickly over the controls as he tried to coordinate the defense. Admiral Vorth is requesting all ship commanders for an emergency meeting. Kala nodded and made her way to the conference room. The holographic projections of the other commanders flickered to life around the table. She recognized most of them. Captain Rel of the Mentari Defense Force, Colonel Dax from the Outer Rim Coalition.
These were good people.
Brave people.
But they all had the same look in their eyes that she knew was in her own. Admiral Vorth appeared at the head of the table. Species was known for being calm under pressure, but even he could not hide his worry. The situation is worse than what we thought. He began without any greeting. Our intelligence teams have identified the swarm's next target. The display changed to show a massive space station, surrounded by hundreds of smaller ships. Sanctuary Station. It's the last safe place in this part of the galaxy. Behind its powerful shields were the evacuation fleets, ships packed with refugees from dozens of worlds that had already fallen to the swarm. "How long do we have?" asked Captain Rel. 2 days, maybe 3, Vorth replied. The swarm is moving faster than before. They consumed the Rigel system completely. All its planets, all its people. They turned everything into more of themselves. Kala felt sick. She had visited Rigel once. Beautiful blue oceans and floating cities. Now it was nothing but empty space. And twisted metal ships hunting for more prey. "What are our options?" asked Colonel Dax. Vorth was quiet for a moment. "We fight. We hold the line as long as we can. We buy time for the evacuation fleets to escape." Everyone knew what that meant. They were going to die here. All of them. The Alliance fleet would make its last stand at Sanctuary Station. They would fight until every ship was destroyed. Maybe they could save some of the refugees. Maybe. The meeting ended with plans that everyone knew would fail. Fallback positions that would not hold. Strategies that had been tried before and failed before. But they had to try. They had sworn to protect the innocent, and they would keep that promise even if it killed them. Kala returned to her bridge as the Alliance fleet began moving toward Sanctuary Station. The journey would take 18 hours. 18 hours, too. Prepare for the end of everything they had fought for. As the Starward Dawn jumped to hyperspace, something unexpected happened. The ship's sensors detected unusual readings from the edge of the system. Long-range scanners showed unknown contacts approaching from the galactic rim. That was impossible. Nothing lived out there. The rim was empty space and dead stars. Commander called out Ensign Yara from the sensor station. "I'm reading multiple contacts coming in from Sector 7. It's unknown ship types. They're not in our database." Kala moved to look at the readings herself. The signatures were strange. The ships were small compared to Alliance vessels, but there were many of them. Their energy patterns were unlike anything she had seen. Not plasma like the Alliance used. Not bioenergy like the Swarm. Something else entirely. "Are they swarm ships?" she asked. "Negative, Commander. Signatures are completely different. These ships are made of metal and other materials I can't identify. They're using some kind of controlled explosion for propulsion. Kala frowned. Controlled explosions? That sounded primitive. Most civilized species had moved beyond such crude methods thousands of years ago. But if these were not swarm ships, then who were they? Open a channel to Admiral Vorth, she ordered. The Admiral's face appeared on the screen. Behind him, Kala could see his own officers working frantically at their stations. Commander Kala, have you seen the sensor readings? Yes, sir. Unknown ships approaching from the rim. We have any idea who they are? None. We're trying to establish communication now. But Kala, this changes nothing. Even if these newcomers are friendly, they can't possibly have enough ships to change the outcome, Kala. Understood. The Alliance had started this war with thousands of ships and the best technology in the galaxy. They had still lost. What could a few unknown vessels do against the Void Swarm? But as she watched the sensor readings, something stirred in her chest. Hope it was foolish. It was probably pointless. But for the first time in months, the Alliance was not alone. Someone else was coming to fight. The unknown ships continued their approach toward Sanctuary Station. Soon they would arrive. Soon they would see what remained of the Great Galactic Alliance. A few hundred ships and a few billion refugees waiting for the end. The comm system crackled to life. A voice spoke in a language that the universal translator struggled to process. The words were harsh and direct, but somehow they carried something the Alliance had not heard in a long time. Confidence. This is Captain Reed of the Earth Defense Force. We received your distress signals. We're here to help you fight. None of them had ever heard of it. But as the unknown fleet drew closer, Kala allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, the war was not over yet. The human fleet emerged from hyperspace with a sound that shook the very fabric of space around Sanctuary Station. Captain Marcus Reed sat in the command chair of the EDF Defiance and looked at the massive alien station before him. It was bigger than anything Earth had ever built, but his sensors showed it was badly damaged. Scorch marks covered its hull, and several sections were completely dark. Around the station, ships of a dozen different designs moved in defensive patterns. Reed had never seen anything like them. Some looked like crystals that had been carved into ship shapes. Others were smooth and curved like sea creatures. All of them showed signs of heavy battle damage. Captain, called out Communications Officer Barnes from her station. We're receiving a transmission from the alien fleet commander, Admiral Vorth, of something called the Arcatanian Hegemony. Reed nodded. Put him through. The main screen flickered and showed an alien face. Vorth looked like a cross between a lizard and a bird, with golden scales and bright amber eyes. Those eyes were studying Red with obvious confusion. Captain, Reed Vorth said, his voice translated by their computers. We appreciate your offer of assistance, but I must ask, what weapons do your ships carry? What defenses do you have against adaptive biomechanical entities? Reed smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. It was the smile of someone who had been fighting wars his entire adult life. Admiral, our ships carry kinetic weapons, chemical weapons, thermal weapons, electromagnetic weapons, sonic weapons, and a few other things we've cooked up over the years. As for defenses, we've got armor. Lots of armor. Worth's confusion was obvious. Forgive me, Captain, but those technologies are quite primitive. The Void Swarm adapts to any weapon used against them. They develop resistance within hours. Your kinetic weapons will be useless after the first engagement, maybe Reed said, but we brought a lot of different kinetic weapons. And when those stop working, we'll use something else. When that stops working, we'll use something else again. The conversation was interrupted by alarms blaring throughout the human fleet. Long-range sensors had detected the approach of the enemy. Reed looked at the tactical display and felt his blood go cold. The swarm fleet was massive. Hundreds of ships that looked like they had been grown rather than built. Organic curves mixed with metallic spikes. They pulsed with an evil red light that hurt to look at. All ships, this is Red. He broadcast to the human fleet. Remember the mission briefing? These things adapt to whatever we throw at them, so we throw everything. Weapons rotation every 3 minutes. no exceptions. Reed had studied every piece of intelligence the Alliance had sent to Earth. The Void Swarm was indeed adaptive. They adapted to patterns. They learned from repetition. The key was to never repeat the same attack twice in a row. Dr. Nira, the Alliance's chief scientist, appeared on a secondary screen. She was a tall, thin alien with pale blue skin and large, dark eyes. Captain Reed, I have been studying your ship designs. Your technology is quite different from ours. May I ask how you developed faster-than-light travel without energy manipulation fields? Reed grinned. We blew things up until we found something that worked. Then we blew up bigger things until that worked better. Dr. Nira looked puzzled. Seems inefficient. Maybe Reed admitted. But it's worked for us so far. We're a stubborn species, Doctor. When something doesn't work, we don't give up. We try something else. And if that doesn't work, we try something else again. We keep trying until something works. The swarm fleet was getting closer. Reed could see individual ships now. They were even more horrible up close. Living metal that writhed and twisted. Weapons that looked like giant insects. And at the center of the fleet, a massive ship that dwarfed everything else. The Hive ship. Colonel Lisa Park appeared on another screen from the EDF Determination. She was in charge of coordinating the human ground forces, but right now she was helping with fleet tactics. Marcus, we've got the weapon rotation schedule locked in. First wave uses tungsten penetrators. Second wave switches to depleted uranium. Third wave goes to crystalline rounds. How many different types do we have? Red asked. Park smiled. It was the same kind of smile Reed had worn earlier. 47 different kinetic projectile types. 63 different chemical weapons. 38 thermal variants. And that's just what we brought with the first fleet. Admiral Vorth's voice came through the come again. Captain Reed, are you saying you brought 47 different types of the same weapon? Not the same weapon, Admiral. 47 different weapons that all happen to throw things very fast at the enemy, plus all the other weapons that don't throw things fast. Reed could see that the aliens didn't understand. They had spent thousands of years perfecting their technology. Each species had developed the best possible weapons for their needs. Energy was clean and efficient. Plasma could be adjusted for different targets. Gravity weapons were precise and powerful. But humans had never focused on perfection. They had focused on options. When facing an unknown enemy, the best weapon was the one the enemy couldn't predict or adapt to. The swarm fleet had almost reached weapons range. Red gave the order for all human ships to take position in the outer defense perimeter. The alien ships looked confused at the human formation. Instead of grouping together for concentrated firepower, the human ships had spread out across a wide area. Instead of forming defensive lines, they moved in seemingly random patterns. Captain Reed, Admiral Vorth called. Your formation appears to be disorganized. How do you plan to coordinate your attack? Reed looked at the tactical display. Swarm ships were arranging themselves in the same pattern they had used in every previous battle. The aliens had shared all their intelligence with Earth. Every battle, every tactic, every weapon that had been tried and failed. Admiral Red said, we're not going to coordinate our attack. We're going to make it impossible for the enemy to coordinate their defense. The first swarm ships opened fire. Beams of bioenergy lanced out toward the Alliance vessels. As always, the initial damage was heavy. But then the swarm ships began adapting their weapons based on how the Alliance shields responded. That was, when the humans opened fire, tungsten rods accelerated to a significant fraction of light. Speed struck the swarm ships like hammers of God. The biomechanical hulls, designed to adapt to energy weapons, had no defense against simple kinetic force. Holes were punched clean through enemy vessels. But Reed knew this advantage would not last long. The swarm would adapt. They always did. The question was whether humanity had brought enough different ways to kill them before they could adapt to everything. The Void Swarm had never retreated before. In 3 years of war, they had never pulled back from a battle. They consumed everything in their path, adapted to every weapon used against them. and moved on to the next target. But now, for the first time, they were running. Fleet Admiral Wright watched the tactical display from the bridge of the EDF, relentless as the swarm fleet fell back toward the outer system. The massive hive ship limped along at the center of the formation, its biomechanical hull still showing the scars from the human attack. Around it, smaller swarm vessels moved in confused patterns, no longer showing the perfect coordination they had displayed before. "Admiral," reported Lieutenant Commander Torres from the sensor station, "the swarm fleet is regrouping at the edge of the system. They appear to be waiting for something." Wright nodded grimly. He had been fighting space battles for 20 years, and he knew that a retreating enemy was often more dangerous than an advancing one, especially an enemy that could learn from its mistakes. "They're adapting," he said, "figuring out how to counter our tactics." "How long until the second human fleet arrives?" 18 hours, sir," replied Commander Johnson from the navigation station. Wright had requested reinforcements as soon as the battle began, not because he doubted the outcome, but because he knew the swarm would not give up after one defeat. They would return with new defenses, new tactics, new ways to counter human weapons. The key was to stay ahead of their adaptation curve. Admiral Vorth's face appeared on the communication screen. The alien commander looked like he had aged years in the past few hours. "Admiral Wright, my tactical staff is trying to understand. What happened in the battle? How did you know the swarm would be unable to adapt to your weapon rotation?" Wright leaned back in his command chair. "We didn't know for sure. But we've been fighting adaptive enemies our entire history. Bacteria that develop resistance to medicine. Viruses that evolve to counter vaccines. Insects that adapt to pesticides. We learned that the best way to stay ahead of adaptation is to never let it catch up." The conversation was interrupted by alerts from the sensor stations. The swarm fleet was moving again, but not toward the human and allied forces. Instead, they were heading toward a nearby uninhabited system. "What are they doing?" asked Commander Kala from the Starward Dawn. Dr. Nira, monitoring from Sanctuary Station, provided the answer. "They're consuming the asteroid belt in the Gamma system, converting raw materials into new ships. But the construction patterns are different. They're building vessels specifically designed to counter kinetic weapons." Wright felt a chill. The swarm was not just adapting their existing ships. They were building entirely new ones from scratch. Ships that would be immune to human weapons from the moment they were created. "All ships, prepare for immediate departure," Wright ordered. "We're not going to let them finish their construction project." The combined human and allied fleet moved out of the Sanctuary system toward the Gamma system. As they traveled, Wright received updates from Dr. Nira about the swarms. Construction activities. The creatures were building ships with thick, angular armor designed to deflect kinetic impacts. They were also developing new weapons, specifically designed to counter human tactics. But Wright had expected this. The swarm's greatest strength was also their greatest weakness. They could adapt to any threat, but they could only adapt to threats they had encountered before. They were building defenses against the weapons humans had already used. They had no idea what weapons humans might use next. The second human fleet arrived just as the swarm finished their construction. Admiral Sarah Chen commanded the reinforcement force from the EDF Vengeance. Her ships were different from the first fleet. Instead of kinetic weapons, they carried technologies that Earth had never used in space combat before. "Right, good too." "See you again," Chen said over the comm channel. "I brought some new toys for our friends." Swarm fleet emerged from the Gamma system with confidence. Their new ships were heavily armored against kinetic weapons. Their formations were designed to minimize damage from multiple attack vectors. They had learned from their previous defeat and adapted accordingly then. Chen's fleet opened fire with weapons the swarm had never seen before. Biological warfare. Viruses designed to attack the organic components of swarm ships. The creatures had no defense against diseases that had been engineered specifically to target their biomechanical systems. Within minutes, enemy vessels began showing signs of infection. Their organic components started failing. Their adaptive processes were disrupted as their own bodies turned against them. The swarm tried to adapt to the biological attacks. Before they could develop immunity, the humans switched to gravitational weapons. Focused gravity fields that created miniature black holes inside enemy ships. The intense gravitational forces tore apart anything they touched. Regardless of armor or adaptive capabilities, Lieutenant Commander Rosa Martinez led another fighter attack, this time using weapons that defied conventional understanding. Quantum disruptors that caused matter to simply cease existing. Temporal mines that created bubbles of accelerated time, aging enemy ships to dust in seconds. Psionic weapons that attacked the swarm's collective consciousness directly. The most devastating attack came from the EDF Prometheus. Captain Bill Davis had volunteered his ship for a special mission. The Prometheus was equipped with a prototype weapon that human scientists had been developing for years. A device that could manipulate the fundamental forces of physics themselves. All ships clear the target area, Davis announced, activating reality distortion field. The weapon created a bubble of altered space around the swarm hive ship. Inside the bubble, the laws of physics worked differently. Gravity flowed upward, time moved backward. Energy became matter, and matter became energy. The biomechanical creature inside the hive ship could not adapt to an environment where the basic rules of existence kept changing. The hive ship began tearing itself apart as its own systems tried to function in an impossible environment. Its adaptive processes evolved over millions of years, had no reference point for dealing with reality itself being broken as the hive ship died. Its death sent shockwaves through the entire swarm network. The creatures had evolved to share information instantly across their collective consciousness. Now, they shared the experience of facing an enemy that could rewrite the laws of physics. For the first time in their existence, the Void Swarm felt something they had never experienced before: fear, the surviving.
Ow.
Swarm vessels began a panicked retreat toward the galactic edge. Their perfect coordination was gone. Their confidence was shattered. They had encountered something they could not adapt to, an enemy that refused to be predictable. Admiral Wright watched the enemy fleet disappear into hyperspace and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The swarm was not defeated yet, but they were no longer invincible. They had learned that adaptation had limits, and humanity had learned that even the most advanced enemy could be beaten with enough creativity and determination. The war was entering a new phase. The swarm would retreat to dark space and try to develop new strategies. But they would face a problem they had never encountered before. They were no longer fighting an enemy that used predictable tactics. They were fighting an enemy that seemed to have an infinite number of ways to wage war. The tide had turned. The galaxy was no longer defenseless against the Void Swarm. Humanity had shown that adaptation could be overcome by innovation, and that sometimes the best defense against a perfect enemy was to be perfectly unpredictable. The battle began exactly as every previous fight against the Void Swarm had begun. The alien creatures opened fire with their bioenergy weapons, sending streams of living light across space toward the Alliance fleet. The energy beams struck shields and armor, probing for weaknesses. Within minutes, the swarm weapons began changing, adapting to whatever defenses they encountered. Commander Kala watched from the bridge of the Starward Dawn as the familiar pattern unfolded. Alliance ships returned fire with plasma cannons and gravity distortion weapons. The attacks struck home, tearing holes in swarm vessels. But even as she watched, the damage began healing. The biomechanical hulls grew new armor. The creatures inside evolved resistance to the weapons hitting them. This was how every battle went. Initial success followed by inevitable failure, as the enemy adapted faster than the Alliance could change tactics. Then the human ships opened fire. Everything changed. The first wave of human attacks used weapons that seemed impossibly primitive. Simple metal rods accelerated to incredible speeds. No energy fields, no exotic matter, no complex targeting systems. Just chunks of tungsten moving fast enough to punch through anything in their path. The swarm ships had no defense against this kind of attack. Their adaptive armor was designed to handle energy weapons and exotic particles. They had no experience with simple kinetic force delivered at relativistic speeds. Holes appeared in enemy hulls. Internal systems were shredded. Several smaller swarm vessels simply came apart under the impact, but Kala knew this advantage would not last. The swarm adapted to everything eventually. Sure enough, after just a few minutes of battle, the enemy hulls began changing. The biomechanical armor grew thicker and more angled. The creatures inside started producing some kind of energy field that helped deflect the kinetic impacts. That was when the human weapons changed. The tungsten rounds stopped coming. Instead, the human ships began firing projectiles made of depleted uranium. The new rounds had different mass and different penetration characteristics. The armor that had adapted to tungsten could not handle uranium. More swarm ships took damage. Major. Tom Bradley coordinated the ammunition rotation from the logistics ship determination. His job was to make sure every human vessel switched to new ammunition types exactly on schedule. No ship was allowed to use the same rounds for more than 3 minutes at a time. All ships switched to crystalline penetrators in 3, 2, 1, mark. Bradley announced over the fleet channel. The human weapons changed again. Now they were firing rounds made of artificial diamond matrix. Then ceramic composite, but then exotic. Metal alloys. Every few minutes, a completely different type of projectile struck the swarm fleet. Admiral Vorth watched the human tactics with growing amazement. They are changing their entire weapon loadout every few minutes. How is this possible? Dr. Nira studied the sensor readings from her science station. Each human ship appears to carry dozens of different ammunition types. They've automated loading systems that can switch between them instantly. I have never seen such tactical flexibility. The swarm was trying to adapt, but they could not keep up. Every time their armor evolved to handle one type of projectile, the humans switched to something completely different. The creature's evolutionary processes could handle gradual changes or even sudden shifts to new weapon types, but they could not adapt to constant random changes across dozens of different attack methods. Then the humans revealed their true tactical genius. As the swarm began developing general resistance to kinetic weapons, the human ships suddenly switched to completely different attack systems. Chemical weapons began striking enemy hulls, corrosive compounds that ate through biomechanical armor, acid sprays that dissolved internal systems, toxic gases that poisoned the living components of enemy ships. The swarm tried to adapt to the chemical attacks. But before they could develop immunity, the humans switched again. This time 2 thermal weapons. Concentrated heat beams that melted armor, flash-free systems that made enemy hulls brittle, plasma torches that burned through anything they touched. Lieutenant. Commander Rosa Martinez led a squadron of human fighters through the enemy formation. Her small ships moved like angry wasps, striking at vulnerable points with weapons that changed every few seconds. Kinetic rounds followed by acid sprays, followed by electromagnetic pulse bursts, followed by sonic disruptors. This is impossible. Transmitted one of the Alliance captains. How many different weapon systems do they have? Captain Reed's voice came through the comm channel. Enough. We've been fighting wars for our entire history as a species. Wars against each other. Wars against our environment. Wars against diseases and predators and natural disasters. We learned a long time ago that the best way to win is to have more ways to fight than the enemy has ways to defend. The massive swarm hive ship at the center of the enemy formation began showing signs of distress. Its biomechanical hull pulsed with angry red light as it tried to process the tactical data from the battle. The creature inside was ancient and intelligent, but it had never faced an enemy like this. Every defense it evolved was immediately countered by a completely different attack. Every adaptation was rendered useless by constant change. The hive ship's strategic mind evolved over millions of years to process patterns and develop countermeasures. Could not handle the chaos of human warfare. The human ships began focusing their fire on the hive ship itself. Instead of concentrating on one type of attack, they hit it with everything simultaneously. Kinetic rounds and chemical weapons and thermal beams and electromagnetic pulses all struck the massive vessel at the same time. The hive ship's adaptive systems overloaded. A could not evolve resistance to so many different attack types at once. Cracks appeared in the biomechanical hull. Internal explosions lit up the creature's nervous system. For the first time in the war, Swarm Hive ship began to retreat as the massive vessel pulled back from the battle line. Something unprecedented happened. The other swarm ships began showing signs of confusion. Their coordinated attacks became erratic. Adaptive responses slowed down. Dr. Nira gasped as she realized what was happening. The hive ship coordinates their adaptation process. Without its guidance, the individual swarm vessels cannot adapt effectively. The human fleet pressed their advantage. More weapon types appeared. Gravity mines that created micro-black holes. Viral programs that infected the biomechanical systems. Psychological warfare broadcasts that somehow confused the swarm's collective intelligence. The tide of battle was turning. For the first time since the war began, the Void Swarm was being pushed back. Their ultimate advantage, their ability to adapt to any threat, had been neutralized by an enemy that refused to use the same threat twice. Commander, Kala felt something she had not experienced in years. Victory was possible. The humans had shown them how to fight an adaptive enemy, not by perfecting one weapon, but by having so many weapons that adaptation became impossible. The swarm fleet began a general retreat, falling back toward the edge of the system. Behind them, they left something they had never left before. Their dead. Swarm ships that could not be repaired or recycled. It's evidence that they could be defeated. The war was far from over, but for the first time, the Alliance had hope. 6 months after the Battle of Sanctuary Station, the galaxy was a different place.
Ow.
The Void Swarm had retreated to the dark space between galaxies. And for the first time in 3 years, the Alliance could focus on rebuilding instead of just surviving. General Patricia Hayes stood in the observation deck of the new Terran embassy on Sanctuary Station and watched ships from dozens of worlds dock at the massive spaceport. Human vessels moved alongside alien craft in patterns that would have been impossible before the war. The two species had learned to work together, sharing technologies and tactics that had once been closely guarded secrets. The embassy itself was a symbol of how much had changed. Built using both human engineering and alien technology, it combined the best of both approaches. Human durability with alien elegance, human adaptability with alien precision. The result was something neither species could have created alone. General Hayes called out Dr. Nira as she entered the observation deck. The alien scientist had become one of humanity's closest allies, spending months studying human military doctrine and strategic thinking. The morning briefing is ready. Hayes nodded and followed Nira to the embassy's war room. The walls were covered with displays showing the current state of the galaxy. Most of the map was green now, indicating systems that were secure from swarm attack. Only the outer rim remained red, marking areas where scattered swarm remnants still posed a threat. Captain Reed was already waiting in the war room, along with Admiral Vorth and several other Alliance commanders. The human officer looked tired, but satisfied. He had been leading patrol missions into swarm territory for months, hunting down the remaining enemy forces. Status report, Hayes requested as she took her seat at the head of the conference table. Reed activated a holographic display showing recent battle data. We engaged 3 swarm vessels in the Arcturus sector yesterday. They were using new defensive techniques, but nothing we couldn't handle. Creatures are still trying to adapt to our tactics, but they're running out of options. Admiral Vorth added his own observations. The swarm's behavior has changed significantly since the initial defeats. They no longer attack in coordinated formations. Individual vessels seem to be operating independently, using different adaptation strategies. It's as if their collective intelligence has been disrupted.
Oh, yeah.
Dr. Nira brought up her research files. I believe the destruction of multiple hive ships has damaged their communication network. The swarm was designed to function as a single organism. Without proper coordination, they cannot share adaptive information effectively. Hayes studied the data carefully. The war was not over, but But the enemy was broken. Instead of one massive threat, they now faced dozens of smaller ones. Still dangerous, but manageable. More importantly, the swarm could no longer learn from each encounter and share that knowledge across their entire species. "What about our own losses?" Hayes asked. Reed's expression grew more serious, light compared to what we expected. "Alliance has lost fewer ships in the past 6 months than they lost in any single month before we arrived. But we're not invincible. The swarm is still learning, just more slowly." This was the challenge humanity faced. They had proven that the swarm could be defeated, but victory required constant innovation. The moment they became predictable, the enemy would adapt. The moment they stopped changing their tactics, they would start losing again. Hayes turned to the long-term strategic planning section of the briefing. This was where the real work was being done. Not just winning battles, but building a future where the galaxy could defend itself against adaptive threats. Commander Lisa Park appeared. On the communication screen from Earth, she was coordinating the massive logistical effort required to supply the expanding war effort. "General, the third human fleet has departed Earth and should arrive in the combat zone within 2 weeks. This force includes the new experimental weapon systems developed by our research teams." Hayes smiled. Earth's scientists and engineers had been working around the clock to develop new technologies, not just weapons, but entirely new approaches to warfare. Each human fleet that arrived brought capabilities that had never existed before. But the most important development was not technological. It was philosophical. The Alliance species were learning to think like humans, to value adaptability over perfection, to see chaos as a tool rather than a problem. Captain Rel of the Mentari Defense Force had been one of the first to embrace human tactical doctrine. His ships now carried multiple weapon systems and changed tactics constantly during battle. Other Alliance commanders were following his example. "The cultural impact has been as significant as the military impact," Dr. Nira observed. "Human strategic thinking is spreading throughout Alliance military doctrine. Our species are learning to be more flexible, more creative, more willing to try unconventional approaches." Nodded. It had always been humanity's greatest export. Not technology or weapons, but a way of thinking. The willingness to try anything, to fail, to try something else, and to keep trying until something worked. The briefing concluded with updates from across the galaxy. Trade routes were reopening. Refugee populations were returning to rebuilt worlds. The massive evacuation fleets that had huddled behind Sanctuary Station's shields were now traveling freely, carrying people back to their homes. But Hayes knew. The real victory was not in the battles they had won. It was in the future they had secured. The galaxy would never again be helpless against an adaptive enemy. They had learned that adaptation could be beaten by innovation, and that the best defense against a learning enemy was to never stop learning yourself. Later that evening, Hayes stood again on the observation deck, watching the traffic around. Sanctuary Station. Human ships carried Alliance technology to Earth. Alliance vessels brought human weapons to distant battlefields. The two civilizations had become something new together, something stronger than either could have been alone. "Captain." Reed joined her at the observation window, carried a datapad with the latest intelligence reports from the Outer Rim. "The swarm remnants are getting desperate," he said. "They're trying more and more extreme adaptations. Some of their ships barely look like the original designs anymore." Hayes took the datapad and reviewed the images. Remaining swarm vessels had indeed changed dramatically. Some had grown massive armor plates that made them look like floating fortresses. Others had become so streamlined they resembled metal arrows. A few had developed completely new weapon systems that defied classification. "They're evolving in random directions," she observed. "No coordination, no overall strategy, just individual survival responses." Reed nodded. "It's actually making them easier to defeat. Before they all adapted in the same direction at the same time. Now each ship is different, but none of them are particularly effective." This was perhaps the most important lesson of the war. Adaptation without direction was just mutation. The swarm's greatest strength had been their ability to coordinate. Their evolutionary responses across their entire species. Without that coordination, they were just individual creatures trying to survive. Hayes handed the datapad back to Reed and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the last remnants of the Void Swarm were still trying to find a way to defeat humanity. They would keep trying, keep adapting, keep evolving, but they would never again pose an existential threat to galactic civilization.
What?
Our next move? Reed asked. Hayes smiled. It was a different kind of smile than the grim expressions human officers had worn during the darkest days of the war. This was the smile of someone who looked forward to the future instead of just trying to survive the present. We keep doing what we've always done, she said. We adapt. We innovate. We try new things. The moment we become predictable is the moment we start losing again. Reed understood. The war against the Void Swarm was ending, but the principles that had won that war would be needed forever. The galaxy was full of threats that had not yet emerged, enemies that had not yet been discovered, challenges that had not yet been imagined. But now the galaxy was ready for them. The Alliance had learned humanity's greatest lesson: that survival did not come from being the strongest, or the smartest, or the most advanced. Survival came from being the most adaptable, from having more ways to solve problems than problems could find ways to stop you. The last report from the Outer Rim Patrol came in just before midnight. 3 more swarm vessels had been destroyed. No human or Alliance casualties. The creatures had tried a new defensive strategy involving quantum phase shifting, but the patrol had countered it with temporal displacement weapons that the swarm had never encountered before. It was a perfect example of the new reality. The swarm could still adapt, but they could only adapt to threats they understood. Humanity kept using threats that had never existed before. Weapons and tactics that came from outside the normal patterns of galactic warfare. As Hayes prepared to leave the observation deck, she received one final message of the day. It was from Earth, sent by the Global Defense Council. The message was brief but significant. Earth was sending its largest fleet yet, carrying not just military forces but also colonists and terraforming equipment. Humanity was not just helping to defend the galaxy, they were planning to stay. The war had brought humanity to the stars, but peace would make them a permanent part of galactic civilization. Human colonies would spread across Alliance space, bringing their culture of innovation and adaptability to every corner of the galaxy. Hayes looked out at the stars one more time before heading to her quarters. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. New problems to solve, new enemies to face. But for the first time since humanity had arrived at Sanctuary Station, she was not worried about the future. The galaxy had learned to fight like humans. That meant the galaxy had learned to survive anything. The Void Swarm had taught the universe a valuable lesson about the dangers of adaptive enemies. But humanity had taught an even more valuable lesson in response. The best way to defeat an adaptive enemy was not to become more adaptive yourself. It was to become so unpredictable that adaptation became impossible. In the depths of space, the last swarm vessels continued their futile search for a pattern they could counter, a strategy they could defeat, a weapon they could resist. They would search forever because the pattern they were looking for did not exist. Humanity had won the war by refusing to fight it the way wars were supposed to be fought. And in doing so, they had shown the galaxy a new way to survive in a universe full of impossible challenges. The future was uncertain, but it was no longer hopeless. Whatever came next, the galaxy would be ready for it.